good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Tom Ruth Speaker Series webcast. As most of you know, the Tom Ruth Speaker Series was created in honor of our longtime beloved instructor of history emeritus, Tom Ruth, who taught at the Hill for 33 years and passed away in February 2016. Our speaker tonight is Stephen Engblom, class of 1985. Stephen is an executive vice president with AECOM, the world's premier infrastructure firm delivering professional services throughout the project lifecycle, from planning, design, and engineering to consulting and construction management. As AECOM's global director of cities, Stephen specializes in urban design, city planning, economic development, and resilience strategies, advising many of the world's largest cities and institutions on their infrastructure strategies and real estate portfolios. The urban services market segment accounts for nearly a third of AECOM's annual $20 billion revenue globally and engages thousands of professionals worldwide. Stephen's global experience allows him to work fluidly across boundaries and cultures and elicit the best from all around him. He calls upon his vast network daily to navigate his global responsibilities on behalf of AECOM and the several boards on which he sits. Now, here's Stephen back in the day, a member of the Hill School class of 1985. See some pretty interesting photographs there. You'll see in a minute, he doesn't look much different. He hasn't aged a year. Told me the last time he wore a tie was when he was on campus about a year ago. And here he is on the cross-country team, described earlier today by a fellow classmate as a track god during his time at Hill. I don't know, what do you have to say to that? Hold on, I'm gonna start your video here. 1 second, working on it. Stephen, what do you have to say to the comment that you were a track god during your time at Hill?
Well, it certainly was a big part of my experience at Hill. So I can't run anymore more than half hour because it kills my knees, but that's why I've started cycling, and those photographs bring back a lot of fun memories.
Which one are you here? Can you tell me where you are?
Yeah, I'm the second from, well, my left,
right
on
here?
The front row there. Yeah.
Right here? Looking
yes.
Good. Wearing the Major H sweater. Were you,
yeah.
you were a 4-year member of track, cross country, and indoor track?
Yes.
I understand you won a few Penn relays in your day?
Yeah, it was amazing. We won 4 years in a row, and it was a lot of great memories. I remember being in that big old stadium down at Penn, and running was definitely a great way to get through high school. It taught me a lot of great skills and competitiveness. So still, you know, athletics is still a big part of my life and just a way I get through the work week. Also, I don't like to get through a day without doing some sort of exercise. So
when you were at Hill, I imagine the track was still around the soccer field, right in the middle of the residential quad there?
It was. In fact, I remember our sixth form year, we had the big benefit of that, the red track that came for a while, and that was a huge advancement over the old cinder track. So the other funny thing I remember is running we didn't have a indoor track at Hill, so when we were at Lawrenceville, it was in their old horse ring, and so I still can conjure up the smell of running at those indoor meets at Lawrenceville.
I don't know if you've seen the new Hauser track out at the far fields, but it's definitely a major improvement over the old track.
I did see it last spring when I was on campus. It's beautiful, yeah.
And when you ran cross country, one of the old traditions, I'm not sure if it still happens today, happened when you were there, but they used to finish the cross country races at halftime of the football games.
That's right, we did that, yeah.
That's a pretty cool way to finish.
Before the Performing Arts Building also, so we used to do a final little lap around the Dell and then come up the final little hill there and across the, I guess it's the north end of the football field, or the east end.
Well, we're hosting Lawrenceville this year for the 133rd year of the rivalry, and I've challenged our cross-country coaches to recreate or simulate that same experience to see if we can get our teams to finish at halftime.
That's fun. That's great.
Well, Stephen, tell me a little bit, where were you from when you came to Hill? I think you were pretty local.
Yeah, I was born and raised in Pottstown, so I was a day student my whole experience at Hill, and you know, it was my parents' dream to have me, you know, go to the Hill, and I was really glad to be able to do it.
How many years were you at Hill?
For 4 years, so from third form to sixth form.
So tell me, you were definitely there during the Tom Ruth era. What impact, if any, did Tom have on your Hill experience?
You know, I don't think I ever took a class with Mr. Ruth, but I know he was a mentor to some of my good friends. And so unfortunately, I never had a class directly with him, but I know he had a big impact on the whole history department.
And who were some of your mentors in those days, faculty mentors?
You know, I had a really lucky experience of having been at the school when there was a Mr. Grutzka. Klaus Grutzka was the artist in residence at Hill, and he was the studio art teacher. So he really had a big impact on me. For some reason, I always knew I wanted to be an architect, and he was pretty amazing. Because I was a day student, I spent a lot of time at the campus doing campus tours. And but the other thing I used to do was Mr. Grutzka would take me sketching. So he, of course, if you know his work, it's a lot of you know, industrial landscapes, and so we would go and sketch the steel mills in Pottstown. And it had a big impact on me because he really taught me, I remember a very specific conversation where he was like, you know, an architect can do more than design houses for people. You know, you know, we talked about the whole sort of city and everything. So that was very formative for me.
I don't know if you know this, but we had, Mr. Kutzka had a show here just about maybe 2 years ago. We had a combined show, 2 artists, including him, and got to see all those sort of industrial stacks and bridges, and you know, it's pretty amazing work. It must have been quite an inspiration to work alongside him as a teacher.
Yeah, one of my prized possessions is one of his paintings. Actually, I visited with him a couple times, you know, after school, and he let me pick one of his paintings, and I have a lovely one of a giant pile of sulfur near the Pulaski Skyway, which is a bridge that goes into New York City. Which has recently been rebuilt. So every time I go over that bridge and I'm, you know, coming from Newark Airport, I think about him.
That's great. So you said that you knew you wanted to be an architect, and that was part of it. Were there other aspects of your Hill experience that gave you some ideas about architecture or planning and design work?
Well, I'm not sure that it was, you know, when you're in high school, that experience I talked about. Oh, I did have a mechanical drawing class with Philip Mile Crane. And that was, I fell in love with drafting in the old arts building. And I think that had a lot to do with it. And the other really interesting experience I had was even, I guess it was after my third form year, there was an alumnus named Richard Franz who had an architecture practice in Pottstown. And he gave me my first internship when, you know, I was probably 14 years old. I would go to his office that summer and just do filing. And it was in the era of, you know, the multi-peaked roofs in the 70s. So all of his buildings had this sort of multi-pitched roofs. And in fact, there's a bank down in the east end of Pottstown that he had designed that across the street from the hospital that has, you know, it's a lot of his buildings. So that was a big impact for me too. You know, just being able to be exposed to what architects did at an early age.
And so after Hill, you went on to Lehigh, correct?
Right.
And what did you study there?
I double majored in architecture and urban studies, which was when I first got exposed to a lot of urban economic theory and politics. So a lot of studying, you know, like New York City urban regeneration, reading, you know, like Jane Jacobs and Jewish American culture and sort of how neighborhoods evolved over time in New York. So that had a big impact on me. And of course, I think I didn't realize it growing up, but growing up in the Rust Belt of Pennsylvania had a big impact also, because back in the, that was in the 80s, and Bethlehem, Pennsylvania had still not recovered, and it was sort of in the depth of its recession. So you had these, looming empty steel mills in that town. And it had a big impact on things that we as young architecture students were studying. And, I was in love with the form of those buildings, but also I think that it just was an incredibly interesting backdrop to be studying urban economic theory, because you were sitting in the middle of a city that still hadn't recovered. And so and even back in the late 80s, New York had yet to really hit its full urban renaissance that we know today. So it was, I think just, studying those classes and then also being in that part of the world had a big impact on me.
So, I obviously know your background and where you've worked and lived over the years. You go from pretty small Pottstown, Pennsylvania to a, globetrotter. I mean, you were in China, you were in Europe, you were in New York, San Francisco. How did you get that sort of wanderlust and start that traveling part of your life?
Well, I think that's one of the aspects about my Hill experience that really, blew my, it sort of took away any sort of sense of limits when you're a, 14-year-old kid, and then all of a sudden you're studying with, sitting next to and becoming friends with kids from around the world. That was a really incredible gift at a young age. And I think that it gave me that sort of connection to the greater world. And I guess it's something that I just have always, I had that experience, and then just, life happens also. And I fell in love and moved to Hong Kong for my relationship. But what turned into is I moved there without a job at about 30, and which now they think about it is crazy, because I'm usually a very, I like to have everything in order. But having done that, what happened was I ended up with a job with a company, and I've been with this company for 20 years now. And, first smaller company, and then we sold that business to this big, AECOM, a global conglomerate. And, for somebody who's really interested in cities, this has been just a sort of, so from that early experience of knowing people from around the world, and then not being afraid to do something like, move to Hong Kong at a young age without a job. I think it just all sort of, I think it's a lot of just being open to experiences. And I think that's, maybe a combination of all those things.
I'm not sure if you tuned in for our last show, but Bernie Chan, who's around your time at Hill.
Yeah, he was a couple years older. Yeah.
Gave us a really amazing glimpse into what Hong Kong is going through right now. But certainly having been to Hong Kong many times myself, I could see the allure of being there, and what especially the impact that might have on someone who's studied cities as long as you have.
Yeah.
So you made your way back to the United States. I know you studied at Rice. That was probably before you went to Hong Kong, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Another, fascinating city. I often say that, the biggest impact of having studied at Rice is that I have an understanding of these sprawling cities, because a lot of urban designers either went to Harvard or they went to Berkeley, and there's this sort of love affair with the tidiness of a compact city like Boston or San Francisco, but most of the world is not like that. So I feel like, having spent 5 years studying and working in Houston, gives me sort of an ability to work with these sprawling cities that can't necessarily translate examples from New York City or from London to a sprawling city like Houston. So I feel really grateful to have been there. Rice is an amazing school, and it's a place that I'm still very active with.
Stephen, I know that you we're going to get into a little bit of what you're doing now and some of your thoughts on COVID-19 and the role of cities, but perhaps like me, you spend a lot of your time traveling to cities all over the country, all over the world.
Right.
You for your clients and me to visit alumni and other families. I don't have a single plane reservation right now. I wonder if you're in the same boat and thinking about like,
Yeah.
not going to an airport anytime in the near future. What does that feel like for you?
Oh, I know. I'm worried about my Instagram followers. It's must not be very much fun to follow me right now. They're tortured with my dog photos. So no, seriously, I have that has been an incredible adjustment over the past couple months. You know, because typically for the past I don't even know how long, I've just had this momentum of probably 6 to 8 flights a month of just constantly on the go. And with that, the momentum and the adrenaline, the sort of interaction with people, it really becomes, you know, the sort of pace of your life. And so all of a sudden to be without that has been an incredible adjustment. I was having a discussion with somebody recently who's in the same boat, and he pointed out that, and it struck me as a really great analogy. He said, you know, at first I thought this would be, it's part of me that loves it. I'm not going to lie. I mean, it's really, I feel very fortunate to have a nice house and live in a wonderful city where I can get out for bike rides. And I incredibly, every day, I don't forget to feel fortunate that I have a job that I can do from my keyboard. But with putting all that aside, there is this, I do miss the adrenaline and the momentum. And at the end of 10 hours of doing Zoom calls all day, this friend of mine pointed out that he feels like he's been on a week-long long-haul flight, which I thought was an apt description, because, you know, after a 10-hour flight to a different time zone, you know how wrecked you feel, and sometimes that's how I feel at the end of the day of these Zoom calls.
Well, one thing I used to say, I travel usually to Asia maybe once or twice a year, 15-hour flight, a little less for you coming from San Francisco, but it was the one time where I didn't have to answer email or cell phone. It was like the only quiet time I had, but now I don't have that anymore. So I'm maybe looking forward to that at some point. Well, Stephen, so about how long ago did you return to San Francisco or come to San Francisco? And then how long since you've been in this current role with AECOM?
So I was in Hong Kong from 2000 to 2005, and then moved to San Francisco in 2005. So it's been the longest I've lived anywhere in my life, which is great. So it's been almost 15 years now, which is hard to believe.
I'm gonna question that. You lived in Pottstown for longer.
Oh, well, okay, you're right. That's right, because I lived in Pottstown till I left Hill, so I would have been, what, 17 or 18? So yeah, I'm coming up on that anniversary.
Perfect.
I stand corrected.
Sorry.
That's all right. Good math skills. So then your other question was, how long have I been in my current role?
How long in this current role?
So it's interesting. So I moved back in 2005, and it was, a couple really good years of, we had just sold a smaller business to AECOM, and my role was to help us build an urban design practice in the US, because we had been doing a lot of, that was a market that we really hadn't gotten into. And at the time, AECOM was more known for transportation and water engineering. So we were doing pretty well, and then the global economic crisis happened. And so in around 2008, there was a counter cycle in economics, though, in South America. So I had a really good run from, probably 2008 till 2012 or so of working in Latin America, which was fascinating. And it was, I think, really enabled by the fact that some of those big Latin American cities have challenges that are very relevant. My experience in China was very relevant to helping those Latin American cities because of the scale and complexity of the problems there. So that was a really life-changing experience also. Unfortunately, just the way the Latin America economy dropped off, pretty much timed with my latest role, which has been to really drive our cities practice, which I can get into.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Like right up until, let's say, January or February, what kind of work were you doing? You talked a lot of your bio talks a lot about infrastructure, urban planning. What does that mean? We have a lot of students listening tonight. What does it mean to be an urban planner, doing infrastructure work, being director of cities, that sort of thing?
Well, so like I said, when I was a kid, I knew I wanted to be an architect. And I think the thing that you study at architecture is, of course, the art of and science of making buildings. But I also think a lot of what you learn is a systematic approach to putting together a complex thing like a building. And what I've learned since, even though I didn't formally study urban design, what I've learned is that systematic approach can scale to something like a city. And so as an urban designer, what I observed in the world is that a budget for an urban design assignment with a city planning department would be X. And then meanwhile, over in the transportation department, a budget for a transportation job would be 100X. And so you pretty much start feeling like a rounding error on some of these big transportation infrastructure projects or big water infrastructure projects. But I also observed that those projects really could benefit from front-end thinking of urban design. So 100 years ago, when a city would have sat down and thought about how were they going to put the city together, they would have hired probably a landscape architect or an architect or a planner. But post-World War II, what happened was we started to get very rational, and engineers stepped up, and we started to, just to keep up with economic demand and population growth, cities started to get really expert at designing highways or designing sewer systems, and we executed really well. But what I think we forgot was the sort of art of city making. And so that's why a lot of our sprawling challenges that we have, physically you have cities that are really challenged right now because of the sprawl, which of course causes environmental challenges. And then a lot of the infrastructure decisions that we made from 1950 till say 2000 also caused a lot of the social inequities we have. So there's a lot of endemic racism and endemic poverty that cities are still suffering because of infrastructure decisions that we made in city making in the second half of the 20th century. So those kinds of things really became, the pillars of what I saw as an opportunity for AECOM to come in and say, we can be your trusted engineers for those amazingly complex transportation systems or those big water engineering or water treatment or sewage treatment plants. But we can be the thoughtful company that can come and actually help you ask the questions. Something I often say is, like, if you ask an engineer a question, that engineer will give you the right answer, guaranteed. So it's not about getting the right answer. I think it's my job in our company is actually about helping to frame the questions. And that's what I really like to say to my clients, like, we can be a more valuable company to you if you actually help us engage us in asking the questions instead of just having us answer the questions.
So give me an example of a client that you work with, again, before COVID-19, and like an assignment or the kinds of questions that you're asking one of your clients. Sure.
So I'll give you an example of one of our first big cities programs was in New York City, in Southwest Brooklyn, after Superstorm Sandy. an area called Red Hook was the last neighborhood to be restored to power. It's one of the most vulnerable neighborhoods in terms of, it's the last neighborhood where the water receded. You probably know that because I know you're from Brooklyn originally, right?
My parents are in Brooklyn, yeah.
Yeah. So this neighborhood has a really complex series of issues, and there are multiple agencies within the city of New York that are working on these issues. So number one, there's no subway to Red Hook. So if you're not on the subway line in New York City, you're not on the economic lifeline of the city. The seawall is, they've got 7 miles of vulnerable coastline. They've got some interim strategies to address those, but none of them are fully, thought of. And there's huge environmental cleanups in the Gowanus Canal. There's the second biggest public housing project that still has temporary HVAC systems sitting on the lawns in front of these public housing buildings. There's a bifurcated, like a really complex neighborhood situation where you have a very vocal group of NIMBY artists that have moved into, NIMBY is not in my backyard artists who don't want to see any development happen in the neighborhood. And then you have the public housing project that, so those are two neighborhoods that don't really communicate well. And so there was no major champion for this project. So what we did was we basically came in and did something that should happen on projects. What I often say is, what we need to do is go in and talk with these clients and say, what projects aren't happening that should be happening? And so what we did was we basically created a laundry list of all of the projects that had to happen to help Red Hook be its best self. So what would it cost to build a subway from Lower Manhattan to Brooklyn? What would it take to complete the seawall? What would it take to provide adequate amount, on par amount of open space to all the residents of that neighborhood, on par with other neighborhoods? So we calculated that cost at a parametric level, and then we said, so if you were to deliver this purely on the back of private real estate, you would have to build, 45 million square feet of development. And what we did was we basically created a calculator that said, if you build 45 million square feet, you could pay for everything. If that's not acceptable to the neighborhood and you only want to accept 25 million square feet, then that's another one. Or if you just want to have status quo amount of development, but depending on what lever you pulled, you could at least be looking at a composite picture of what the city would have to come up with to pay for all of the infrastructure. So that's an example.
And so what did Red Hook choose?
Well, look, my job is to actually, I think of myself as sort of a provocateur of these ideas. There are that program, and again, this is all pre-COVID, so it almost feels like I'm talking about something from the 1950s, but this program was put into Governor Cuomo's State of the State that's saying, we need to extend the subway over, and they have built temporary seawalls there. There are a lot of ideas. I think what we did was we provoked a bigger discussion, and it's not always in urban design. The one thing that I've realized is that this is not a career for somebody who wants results tomorrow, because unfortunately, as an urban designer, these things can take decades, unless of course you live in China, and then they happen a lot quicker.
Are you worried that, I'm sure you were working on a number of projects right up until January and February. Are you worried that all those things are just going to be out the window? No one's going to get back to those for years and years?
I mean, the other thing about being an urban designer is you got to be an optimist, because the scale of the urban infrastructure challenge we have globally is pretty amazing. I mean, if you think about, we expect to have 1 billion more people on Earth in the next 10 years. In urbanized areas, that means about 100 million people a year. That's like building 10 New Yorks a year. So we have to do this in order to keep up with population and climate challenges, and in order, frankly, the thing I think about, you asked the question earlier, what is infrastructure? And I think infrastructure is enabling economic development. It's about enabling population growth. If we don't have the infrastructure, that's what I always say, is like we can't be talking about these sort of cold systems like, oh, it's transit or it's water. It's about, we're the framework for life. And so if we don't do it, we're going to have serious consequences. And so pre-COVID, we had huge issues. Trillions of dollars more need to be spent on infrastructure, and yet somehow as a society we're resistant to doing that. And so I've been, sort of really engaged in a lot of discussions about how can we pay for the infrastructure we need in ways that are, either we need, big societal change and political change, or we're going to have to come up with some pretty innovative ways to pay for it in ways that we haven't thought of before.
So pivoting for a minute, you have a lot of connection all around the world. I know you do business in China. Your company does business in China. You spent time in China and Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. When did you start to first become aware of and perhaps nervous about the growing impact of COVID-19?
Well, started hearing about it. Our operations were shut back in January timeframe. January, February, it was a big deal for our Asia operations. So that's when I first started hearing about it. And it's interesting to think about the timeline that we're talking about in the US right now, because January, February, so January, they start shutting operations in a country like China, where there is the ability to really dictate and monitor and not have a great societal debate. It was like, this is how we're going to handle this. And so what is it now? It's mid-April, and even still, I was just on a call with our Shanghai office on Friday last week, and we were interviewing with some clients, and one of our key people was in our Shenzhen office. That person could not fly from Shenzhen to Shanghai without, if you fly internally in China right now, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks before you can go into the office. So it was, it wasn't that he couldn't get there. It's just that, that you have to make a calculated decision about, if you're going to fly, it's going to cost you 2 weeks. Yeah. So that's 4 months in or 3 months in. And I think that's pretty quick. So, it's pretty eye-opening. And then think about us as a society where we either debate or Neanderthal our way through these discussions. It's kind of it's a little worrisome. I think our timeline's going to be longer. So what role do you think that cities are playing, both in spreading COVID-19, and then my second question, which is probably a longer question, is what role will cities play in solving COVID-19 or adapting to COVID-19? Yeah, well, the first question about, I believe that, cities at first, the sort of the early narrative was, cities are these high density places, and what actually was the catalyst for me to write that article was this, I've kept hearing about this, reading other articles about like predicting the end of cities. And it just occurred to me that, first off, I don't think that's possible to imagine life without cities, because we're the sort of brain trusts and the economic engines for everything that I talked about before. So I do think, though, that the nature of our global economy obviously has a lot to do with why we're in the situation that we're in today, because this pandemic is so easily spread. And you know, everyone's seen articles about that. But what I think is also become evident is that it's not just it's not just as simple as a high density place is the problem, because I've seen you know, New York, of course, is the epicenter of the trauma right now, and just my heart goes out to you know, New York. But San Francisco is the second densest city in the United States, and the leadership that we've had here early on, and luckily have been able to navigate and really approach early. So our mayor was the first city in the country to have a shelter-in-place order, and then quickly followed by the statewide mandate. And so what I've been sort of really just watching closely is how much of a political clout mayors and governors have assumed in the past couple months has been something that I've actually really been excited about, because I've thought for a long time that cities are ascending in world importance, and this idea of nations, I think, is declining. And I think that's my own personal take on sort of the nationalism situation that's causing a lot of the political challenges around the world is just sort of a back end result of the fact that really the power system exists in cities to cities as opposed to nations to nations.
Yeah.
And I think that the short term rise in power of the mayors and governors, I believe, is a structure that sort of I think is an early indicator of where the world is going. And the inefficiencies and the lack of addressing the urban infrastructure that you know, we as a broad country, or we as a sort of a world of urban haves and rural have-nots, has been this divide of why should we be paying for urban infrastructure when we have half of our people don't live in cities. I think the point I was making in my article is that I think that sort of that we have to really start, you know, we have to continue acting globally, because I think it's naive to think that we're not going to be a global society after COVID. But I think that what I've seen is that, you know, just regionally, we have to start coordinating more. And that's something that, you know, sort of the local infighting in a place like the Bay Area about sort of the suburban communities versus the urban cities, I've seen them come together in this crisis in a way that hadn't been ever evident in the 15 years that I've lived in the Bay Area. So I hope that that's something that we can hold on to after the crisis.
Yeah, I've been really interested, Stephen, in that what I see is a fundamental shift from sort of national power to state and local power. I was commenting to my daughter the other day, who's a 11th grader, that I know more governors' names today than I ever did before. And I'm not sure I know as many that many mayors' names, but you know, we're certainly seeing the rise of the governor and the mayors, and then one topic that I found interesting in your writings, which I didn't know much about, is this notion of a mega region and the collaboration among governors and these sort of, you know, the Northeast acting together, or the Midwest acting together, the Southeast, or you know, you mentioned, I think 5 mayors in the Bay Area all sort of came together to do that initial shelter in place. So I find that fascinating, and I can only imagine, as an urban planner, as someone who thinks about cities and these kinds of issues, how that could be monumental and incredibly dynamic for how we think about life on this planet.
Yeah, it is. It is something that I've been reading about a lot the past couple of years. So it's certainly not an idea that I came up with, but it's an idea that I've been really thinking a lot about, because I see places like California, if it could act as a whole, California in and of itself is, you know, the 5th largest economy in the world. And yet it doesn't really function that way. You know, statistically that's true, but for decades we've been trying to create a high-speed rail between Los Angeles and San Francisco. And if we could do that, then the there's a concept in urban planning called our city. And basically it's this idea that historically cities have always operated on an hour. So it's a time unit of an hour. And so what that meant was, historically people could walk from a walled city out into the fields and then back into the city in an hour. So that was basically the economic functioning module of a city, is an hour. And so this concept that was developed in the 70s, this Italian economist came up with this observation that as we build more and more sophisticated transportation capabilities, that our module can expand. So and he cited different, you think about the industrial era. So we built our railroads to get out to the suburbs, and so the people could move out of the city. And so to me, that's really where, I've been thinking about this even pre-COVID, like what would it take to what's the next our city? And I believe that the mega regions will be enabled and actually be able to function within an hour. So if you were able to build a high-speed rail between LA and San Francisco, all of a sudden you have a functioning area of 125 million people that could act and compete globally as one region. Same thing, Texas Triangle or, the Northeast. In many ways, these already act as economic areas, but they're dysfunctional because they don't have, people are stuck in unbearable commutes, or the transit systems are terrible and in complete disrepair. So that's something that I think these mega regions will start to take place. And economically, I think it's really interesting also because in most of these catchment areas, you have a political divide where you have people that are part of the global economy. So, right now, I think during COVID, I think this is particularly exacerbated because you have people that can work from their keyboards. And then you have, a lot of people that just can't work right now. So we're going to have to solve this in the short term. And so, it's been amazing to me to all of a sudden watch a country that's been unwilling to pass an infrastructure bond for the past, 10 years. And then all of a sudden we can turn on $2 trillion to solve a problem. So, I just think that, that's unprecedented. And with that sort of spending, I think we should be challenging ourselves to do things in ways that have never been done before. And I think those mega regions, that's a missing middle in our structure. And I think that if we could get the mayors, like during this health crisis, to work with the surrounding counties and regions, you could see a lot of economic strategies that might be able to help a broader base of people.
So what you're describing is a potential that the COVID-19 experience could be a catalyst for this collaboration among cities, states, smaller regions,
right,
mega regions. Do you think that will last, or do you think that once we get past this, we're just going to go back to our normal divisiveness and this is my state, that's your state?
Well, look, I think it's a lot. I think nature fills a void, and without national leadership on some of these issues, local and state level leadership will fill in. This was happening before COVID. So, we've had climate leadership coming from states and cities. So I think there are indicators that pre-COVID that this kind of, stepping up in power was already happening. And that's not just a U.S. Thing. There's evidence of, I think, some pretty smart things globally happening that would suggest that this regional concept is catching on. In China, they require all the megacities. The Chinese government require every megacity to do a rural development plan. So every year they have to do a 10-year long-range plan for the city. And starting this past governmental cycle, they are now requiring Chinese cities to do a rural development plan also. So as you may know, in China, they have a two visa system where they have rural citizens and they have urban citizens. So every city is now responsible for thinking of an economic development strategy for their entire catchment area. And I think that would be a wonderful idea for the US to borrow. And I think it would help us, you know, for instance, I often think about this, that I have more in common with people that live in New York or people that live in Sydney than I do with people that live in the Central Valley of California. And that's something that I think needs to be fixed.
So Stephen, in just a moment, I'm going to ask our audience to start asking questions. So I'm going to give them the hint on how to do that. I have one or two more questions for you myself before I turn it over to our audience. But if you're in the audience and you want to ask Stephen a question, you can use the Q&A box, which is the little Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can just type in your question, and I will read that to Stephen, and you can either let me know whether it's okay to use your name or not. And then you can also raise your hand, and that's the most fun. You can ask your question live, either with video or without. So get your backgrounds ready, or do your hair. I did my hair before the show. All set to go. So please feel free to ask a question. Type that up here. I also, Stephen, by the way, one of your classmates has sent me a picture of you from 1985. If things get a little slow here, I may have to show that.
Oh, please start asking questions.
So my last question, you mentioned it briefly, and I know it's part of your work, and it has to be part of your work as someone who thinks about cities, is climate change and climate issues. We're reading a lot of articles right now about how, without everyone driving and, without manufacturing going, that there's some major impact on the climate. What are you learning about that right now?
Well, the air quality is incredible right now. I don't know if you've noticed it where you are, but in California, where typically we have a lot of air quality issues, it has been incredibly clear. I do worry, though, that we may have a false sense of security about that, because hurricane season is coming up, and fire season in California, and I really worry, and this is something we've been thinking about, is scenario planning about what happens if we're still in shelter in place and there's still a health crisis, and then all of a sudden it gets layered on a hurricane or a fire or a terrorist attack or something like that. I mean, it's really this kind of resilience scenario planning that we've been doing for the past 10 years as a society. We know what we need to do, so we just have to start doing a lot of this planning and enacting. But I just in the short term, I've just been enjoying the air quality, and it's been great reading the stories about seeing in Venice the clear canals. So.
Well, we have our first question, so I don't have to show that picture just yet.
Okay.
Someone has raised their hand. Wendell Hollins. Hold on, I'm going to unmute. Are you there? Hold on. It's always a little challenging.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Yes.
All right. It's Wendell Hollins, class of 1975. Enjoyed your talk. Two things. Historically first, and then the next for the future. I had always heard that interstates and cities were purposely run through Black neighborhoods on purpose to break up the neighborhood. I don't know if that's true, and I want to get your perspective on that. But more importantly, looking forward to the future, you talked about China, and you talked about cities in California working with New York. What are your ideas on getting cities to collaborate more in the midst of where we are right now?
Well, I always, whenever we're looking at one of these big urban projects, I always like to look back at history. And I do believe that, as a society, we have got to prioritize these, and really think about, I made a comment earlier about the scale of these budgets of these big infrastructure projects. The transportation budgets are huge for these infrastructure projects, and every one of them now requires a, sort of showing what your equity impacts are. So I think it's really important that this generation of urban infrastructure is held to task of, how are you going to solve the urban inequities that we have in our cities? And that's taking many forms, like discussions around, how do we use the infrastructure? Every dollar spent on infrastructure creates $4 worth of urban impact. So that includes things like jobs and education. It's a pretty complex set of questions that you're asking, but I do think that historically we have to own up to the fact that there were some pretty bad practices put in place in our cities, and even if there were good intentions, the results have been pretty disastrous, and the income inequalities and the even just the air quality impacts that have been well documented on many neighborhoods, and you read about COVID and the sort of the inequitable impacts it's having on many urban neighborhoods. It has a lot to do with the fact that there's pre-existing conditions like asthma at much higher rates in these these impoverished neighborhoods. So because the highways are there, or the so I hope that my big hope is that we're going to be able to rebuild infrastructure with new technologies, whether it be electrical railways, freight rails coming in with either electric or hydrogen, and that would help alleviate the air quality issues at least.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Wendell.
Stephen, we have a few written questions here as well, which I want to get to. What American city do you think is doing it right currently? What city are you most proud of, maybe other than San Francisco? Because I know you love San Francisco, but are there cities that are really doing this well, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think New York has had a really great run at doing some innovative approaches, in terms of like a big city. But let's not forget about sort of the mid-scale city too. So I think there's been a big uptick in these quality of life indicator lists, like like places like Portland or Nashville or Austin. They rank consistently high in these livability indexes. And I think all of those, one thing they have in common is that they have these downtowns that are well loved by people in the city that live there, but they also have become these great tourism destinations. So, hopefully as we get back to traveling, which I'm confident we will, those places will have some good lessons for the, I think it's important to think about scales too, because not everybody can relate to, lessons learned from New York.
Yeah, thank you. Our first question, written question, what are some books you'd recommend reading for someone interested in learning more about infrastructure and urban planning? I'm currently reading The Power Broker by Robert Caro, but would love to hear your thoughts and reading suggestions.
Okay, so one of those classes that I mentioned at Lehigh, we had this great teacher named Dave Amidon, and Power Broker was a nightmare of a class for mine, because the way for that person who's reading it, it's about, I can't remember how many pages it is, but it must be close to 1,000 pages or something. Yeah. So we had these pop quizzes, and he would purposely not ask things about really important things. He would ask trivia questions from the chapters to ensure that we read it. So it's a great book. I would say that of course the classic counterpoint to that is Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities. So reading the Power Broker and then Jane Jacobs as a sort of counterpoint, there was a great show at, in fact, there's a book now that compares Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses, because Jane Jacobs, of course, was the mother of the sort of fight to save the West Village, and she became a very famous academic, and so that's a good book.
Great. All right, we're going live. I'm going to add some video here. Hold on a second. One of your classmates has a question for you. And where'd he go? Oh, there he is.
Paul Fulmer.
Paul Fulmer. He's wearing, and he said he's wearing his Lafayette sweatshirt.
Oh, get out of here.
It is so great to see you again. I am, and I'm totally impressed by your career and your observations. It's really something, Stephen.
Oh, thank you very much. That means a lot.
Paul, you have a question for Stephen, or were you just coming on to heckle him with your Lafayette sweatshirt?
Actually, that's what I was doing. So actually, I wrote the question out, Zach, and now
I can read it if you like.
Okay, thank you.
Stephen, it's a little weird to read while you're sitting there, but
sorry.
Stephen, it's been many years since we have spoken. I've been having conversations with friends and colleagues about our internal governance. It seems that a country of our size is realistically ungovernable, and that the decision-making should be driven down to the most local of levels. I am intrigued by this in the context of our federal democratic republic. Do you believe the future will rest on governors and mayors? And how do we embrace a framework for collaboration and discussion, given that the state borders are somewhat arbitrary, given how our country has developed?
Yeah, well, that's what I would just Google these mega region maps. It's an idea that's completely enamored me. And, I just know that functionally, the state borders don't mean much around these mega cities. So, and again, it's impossible to have these conversations right now without pointing to how regions are collaborating on this, COVID response. So you see the governors of the Connecticut, New York, New Jersey working together. So I do believe that, I don't know how soon it will happen, but I do believe, I just think that we could get some of the inefficiencies out of our system if we, just kept some of, I know this is pretty radical, but why not? I think that we should restructure our tax system and keep a lot more tax to your local mega regions, so that the infrastructure that your life and your economic well-being depend on are better managed locally, instead of sort of this whole national discussion that seems frankly pretty ineffective right now.
Yeah, I mean, I live in Lancaster, and which is not far from where you grew up, and I was on a phone call today with two people from the Hill School, a conference with an economic development group involved here locally. And look, when you know people, and when there's a certain scale to a community, you can talk to people, you can have a conversation. There's some integrity associated with it, and it's just sort of an interesting thing. We seem to lose the vitriol and the sound bites and whatever when we're talking to people that we know, and we're actually trying to solve real world problems locally.
I would say, though, that it's tempting to only look in that direction, but I think we also have to look back in the other direction and look at the local infighting that happens also. That, I know, like here in the Bay Area, one of the biggest roadblocks to having the high-speed rail come through is not at the state level. It's actually in some of the communities that don't want the last leg of the high-speed rail to come through. So that's where I think the middle scale is really important, because we can make decisions at a regional level. An interesting bit of history is that London, from the 50s until the 80s, was really losing ground in competitiveness with other European cities, until in the 1990s, they created what's called the Greater London Authority. And what they did was they amalgamated regional decision-making from dozens of townships into what is now the Greater London Authority. And they have a wide range of authority over making decisions about transit, police force, all sorts of things. And I think that there's also incredible inefficiencies in every town having a police force, or every town having a fire force. So there's a lot of lessons that can be learned in that, but it's not to say it's going to be easy, but don't let a crisis go to waste. Like, this is the time that we should be challenging ourselves and saying, how can we do things differently with all of this money coming in?
One of the things, Stephen, that we didn't get to on Tuesday with Bernie Chan was this conversation about how different cities are performing differently with COVID-19, and certainly states are. We saw that sort of viral chart, viral no pun intended, but that went viral about Kentucky versus Tennessee, And Bernie could have talked for hours about the difference between Singapore and Hong Kong and how they've reacted. But, you know, it's interesting because the virus, unlike other maybe political issues, it doesn't really respect a border. But yet we are seeing certain regions perform better in terms of their mortality rates, in terms of their response rates and economic recovery when they're going back to work and when they're not. So sorry, Paul. I'm going to turn you off now.
Well, thank you. Good to see you, Stephen.
Please give my best to Daniel and Carver.
Daniel was just here, but he ducked out because he didn't want to be on screen. So
we'll say hi to him. Tell him his buddy Griffin says hello.
I shall. See you. Good to see you, Stephen.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, we have another attendee with his hand up, one of our young alums, August Buva. Hold on one second. I'm going to allow him to talk. August, are you there?
Muted. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Terrific, terrific. Hey, Stephen, just want to say thank you for doing this. I'm actually back in Pottstown right now at my parents' place, but typically I'm living in DC, working in infrastructure as well. So I wanted to ask you a question about how do you think this virus will impact the playbook that had been written up until about 3 months ago regarding smart cities and development in urban space? And do you think that with this adaptation to remote work, smart city development and the way the city of the future, will that model change due to this, or is this all temporary and we'll be able to go back to what we had predicted before this?
Yeah, well, look, I think we're at even before COVID, I think we were at a turning point in history where we're no longer talking about just building cities, but we're actually in an era of managing cities. So one of the conversations that we've been having in this COVID response is like, how do we actually make data-driven decisions on return to service? Like right now, that's the big topic, is how do we do this dance of coming back into, getting out of our houses and back into society? And there's been some amazing advances in technologies and sort of, ability to use data from our cell phones to, predict, a wide range of things. So I think that, for me, the answer is somewhere in that we have to make these decisions using data, and that's something that's here to stay. I also think that, something I'm really, something we could talk in an entire hour about on its own is that, there's this sort of, data is the biggest economy in the world today, outpacing, oil and gas. And yet it's been sort of absent in how we pay for urban infrastructure. So I've been really advocating for a deep look into, how do we, pay society a data dividend, so this digital dividend to pay for urban infrastructure. So, smart cities has become a saying that almost becomes everything. So those are some sort of ways that I've been thinking about it, is that, we have to manage cities. We're not just building them anymore, and data has got to be a partner in these decisions.
August, it's great to hear your voice. I hope you give your family my best.
Thank you. Thank you to Zach and Stephen. I appreciate this the series existing, and appreciate both of you being involved in it.
Where do you work, August? You say you're in infrastructure. What are you doing?
I work for Deloitte, their infrastructure and capital projects group, government and public services. So I actually have a little experience in smart cities.
Would love to talk. Let's chat.
Perfect. I'll ping you on LinkedIn.
Thanks.
August, I can put the two of you together too.
Terrific. Thank you.
Take care. Okay, we have a written question here. Here we go. From one of our alums, Leon asks, what personal skill sets are the most important in achieving success in your work? Your type of work, I guess.
I often think it's about, like, I think of myself as, it's like, when I made a decision in my career to step back from just focusing on design and getting into the sort of whole sort of strategy world, I think I had to, it's a bit of an ego check, because as in architecture school, you're sort of taught, like, to be the sort of the designer as the, sort of the magician. But I think it's more about just orchestrating and choreographing all the different expertises in the room. So, I think it's about bringing out the best in everybody in the room is what I think is really important in urban design, because you have to, there's a lot of conflicting information, and what you have to do is connect the dots between all of these conversations. So I think that, and then just being curious about stuff.
Great. Another question from one of our faculty members. Do you have any thoughts on the trackless tram concept, such as the autonomous rail rapid transit out of Zhuzhou, China, for connecting smaller cities to larger ones?
Yes, I do. I think that these technologies are going to be, I mean, they're here already. Like you cite the example in China. I'm not familiar with that exact one, but I think that as we go forward, we shouldn't be afraid of these new technologies. I think we should be embracing them. And I think that the cost of heavy transportation infrastructure that we really seem incapable of affording or desiring, I think there's got to be a give and take in the discussion. So I'm a believer in these these automated rapid transit. So ARTs, maybe, I don't know if people in the audience are familiar with bus rapid transit, but the idea. So originally we had streetcars, and streetcars are very expensive. So a lot of cities are trying to go to bus rapid transit, which is essentially, sort of a linear route. And all of these systems have a place in our ecosystem, but the more expensive, more fixed rail has a place, but you have to have super high volumes and super high density to afford those. And in many of our, especially American cities where we have more sprawling areas, we have to be cognizant of the fact that we can't afford to build light rail into every far-flung suburb. We should be, really embracing these automated rapid transit vehicles. So yeah, I'm a big fan of those.
For what it's worth, we're talking about bus rapid transit here in Pottstown, connecting from Reading to Philadelphia, since we are unlikely to bring back rail transit. So we've been having some pretty, I would say, positive and enthusiastic conversations about that here. So I'm eager to see that happen. That would certainly help our region a lot. Okay, and another question comes from Tim. He wants to know, how do you see the impact of the fourth industrial revolution playing out in the next decade, and which cities are better placed to thrive?
Yeah, so the fourth industrial revolution is, if other people in the audience might not know about it, but really I think it is the big challenge for every city to sort of figure out how do you compete in a sort of the digital economy. But one of the points that I made in my short essay about, sort of the COVID crisis bringing to light some big challenges, I believe that we're overexposed to the global supply chain. So I think there's a big opportunity to address this by really thinking hard about how do we bring back advanced manufacturing into the United States as a way to drive jobs into our regions and thereby, really help an economic crisis that existed even before COVID. Talking about Houston this week, and the Houston port is the biggest land base at a port anywhere in the country, and as we consider a post-carbon world and you get into a fourth industrial revolution world, how could that area become sort of a manufacturing breadbasket of jobs for the entire central United States? I think that's why, so these big cities have human capital and economic power to attract those kind of new industries. And so, but I also believe that, that's the comment I made earlier about, figuring out creative ways to have the data, economy help you pay for these is also a really important component to that.
Thank you. One of our faculty members, Mr. Dahlhoff, says, earlier, Mr. Engblom talked about being a provocateur when working with cities to help them be forward-thinking. I am wondering if he could share an example when he and his company acted in this role and their client actually took on one of his more provocative suggestions, perhaps to their surprise.
Well, one of the things, yeah. So one example, when Mayor Khan came into office in London, he made a very bold statement that he didn't want to see any fare hikes for the entire Transport for London system. So we thought about that as an opportunity, and we went to them and talked about, have you considered these transit systems control a huge amount of land that's often, just thought of as operational lands or things like that. So in a global city like London, where the prices of real estate are really a huge asset, we went and talked to them about, what if you actually thought about an entire portfolio approach to your real estate? And that was a pretty provocative idea. Internally, we had some discussions that people were, sort of, oh, maybe we shouldn't bring that up. But actually, they have created a real estate approach, and so that's something I feel really excited about. And that you're seeing a lot more transit agencies around the world actually create real estate divisions, which I think is a really good direction.
Okay, another question here. Marginalized communities have higher rates of undiagnosed respiratory disease and cardiovascular diseases, which is made even more evident and apparent now by COVID-19. What are your thoughts on the role that equity plays in building sustainable infrastructure?
Yeah, well, like I said before, I think that first off, even during my career, I've had a huge learning curve on this. I was lucky enough to be part of what was called the Resilient Bay Challenge over the past, coming up on the 2-year anniversary of it. And I got to work with East Oakland, and got to spend a lot of time with a number of neighborhood groups that live in that neighborhood. And it was quite interesting because as an outsider, and somebody from relatively privileged class came in with this sort of notion that I was doing good because we were coming in and looking at sea level rise challenges, and it sort of quickly there was an uprising during the entire proceedings, not necessarily against anything that I was doing or my particular company was doing, but just in general, there was this sort of really pivotal moment in the whole process where the local communities were like, what are you talking about sea level rise? We're worried about, losing our house because we don't have jobs. And so there was this moment where we had a lot of reckoning between what were the priorities. And that really was a huge educational process for me. And so I things like, this environmental gentrification is something that we have to be really aware of. But at the same time, I've learned that we have to find ways of communicating that those sea level rise challenges are not completely remote ideas. Most of that neighborhood happens to be in a flood prone area, which makes financing of any sort of home improvement programs much more difficult. So if we can find ways to make an infrastructure project that takes entire neighborhoods out of the FEMA flood maps, all of a sudden it opens up a lot of new economic incentive programs that could help those neighborhoods actually build wealth within the existing community. So that's an example that I lived, and there's examples of that all over in every city.
Well, Stephen, we're going to run out of time, so there's no other questions, so I get to ask the last question, which is important.
Okay.
It's on my mind. I hope it's on some of the minds of people listening, which is, what lessons can you draw from your work with cities that would help a college or a residential boarding school prepare for what's to come next year and beyond? how do we get back to work as a school, as a residential school?
Well, this whole concept of return to service is something that I've seen cities start to organize their thinking around. So I would say let's think about that and what's your return to service strategy. I also think that like for instance, we as a company, a big global company, we've been thinking about, well, what have we, how do we quickly create, maybe draw some lessons learned from these short-term challenges that we've been having? Like, what does it mean? How much have we gained by this increased virtual activities? What could you be doing? Maybe before, one school only has access. Like we've been doing these really interesting panels that typically, if you were to organize a panel to talk about a topic in a city, it would be a very costly and a costly event if you wanted to fly a guest in from a different city. Now, all of a sudden, it becomes completely possible that you could have, like you're doing today, you'd have people from, when I came to the campus last year, it was, 3 days of my time. And now here we are doing something really innovative. And I think that those are the kind of things that we can increase our networks and, do things with, your sister institutions that maybe not have been possible before.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've been working with other heads of school in our region and obviously around the country, but we have a weekly call with the heads of the Mid-Atlantic boarding schools talking about what can we be doing collaboratively, whether it's calendars, whether it's, we were talking today about purchasing PPE together, putting in larger orders and that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of those lessons as well that we're seeing mayors or governors doing that. But what you bring up is an excellent point. I'm excited to continue the Tom Ruth Speaker Series in this way next year.
Yeah.
Even if we can get people to campus, we certainly can reach more people doing it this way. Well, I lied. We have one last question.
Okay.
And it comes from Kathy Skitko. Kathy works with our Hobart's Run neighborhood improvement initiative. And she says, Pottstown has seen remarkable progress towards revitalization. And like so many other small cities, the impact of COVID-19 on recently opened and growing businesses has been devastating. If you were to offer one piece of advice to these Pottstown businesses, restaurants, brew pubs, niche retail, and entertainment venues, what advice would you offer to encourage them in this new and uncertain reality? How must they adapt to thrive?
Yeah, it's a tough challenge, and I could maybe send some links. I think just to avail themselves, like it's a challenge when you're, to even keep up with the incentives that are being offered by some of this federal funding. You have to be pretty smart about where to apply for those, and I think that those are really are tricky for cities or towns without a lot of resources to actually proactively go for those. Like, so that's one thing I would say is just maybe just try and be smart about the inventory of opportunities that are out there because of these CARES and upcoming stimulus packages. And then the other thing that I think that often gets forgotten, like small towns, I find that actually, the conversation we were just having, Zach, about your sister institutions, I found that there's a real inefficiency in small towns. Every town feels like they need to come up with a resilience strategy or a, sort of a downtown revitalization strategy. I was just having a conversation with the state of California that it would be great if they actually asked small towns to actually aggregate similar ideas. So maybe Pottstown could look at towns around it, like Royersford and Phoenixville, and just say, hey, we all have these downtowns that are struggling. What if we put together a whole, small towns of Montgomery County, and you had a downtown, revitalize all of Montgomery downtowns, and you thought together. I think there's power in that sort of, collective, aggregating an idea instead of just trying it, just going the road yourself.
Yeah. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for making the time today. It's been really informative. It's great to see you. And clearly our audience stuck with us for almost an hour and a half, which means that you did a great job. So I'll look forward to welcoming you back to campus at some point. Hopefully you won't have to.
Are we going to see the picture? Are we going to see the photograph?
Oh, you want to see the picture, huh? All right.
Well, sort of. You brought it up, so.
Okay, here we go. I'm going to share my screen here. Always dangerous, but here we go. Can you see that?
Oh my God.
I think that's you back here in the back. Is that you?
That is me. Yeah.
This is from 1985. I see some steel stacks in the background. I see a sixth form Hill blazer here, but there's girls, so I'm not sure how that all happened. Do you remember this picture?
Yeah, I'm sure it's all Oldfields girls, and there's Michael Schreffler on the far left.
Yeah.
And I don't know who sent in the photo. Is that Paul Fulmer there too?
That's Paul sent in the photo. Yep. Paul's
yeah,
he's the provocateur
right there.
tonight. Yeah.
And I see a lot of Varnays, which are coming back in style. So
yeah,
it's all good.
Some jean jackets, maybe some member-only jackets in there somewhere.
Right.
Pretty good. Yeah. So this was like when we used to bring in other sister schools for dances and that sort of thing. Oldfields was coming up.
Right. I guess you don't do that any longer.
No, we don't. We're co-ed now, so it's okay.
Okay.
All right. Well,
all right.
Thanks for joining us. I just want to share with our audience our upcoming speakers. We've filled in some of the gaps with some exciting speakers. We've got on Tuesday, April 28th, Krista Tijan, class of 2008, who is a social influencer and works for Reebok's global PR team, will join us and talk to us about social influencers in the age of COVID-19. I'm excited. We just booked Justin Newton, class of 91, will join us next Thursday, April 30th. He's the CEO at Netkey, which does some blockchain work and cryptocurrency work, but is also working on something really interesting about credentialing people after COVID-19 who are test negative or antibody positive. So we're going to be interested to hear from him. He's another Californian. I won't have to wear a tie for that one. I think for the next two speakers, though, I'm going to have to put my tie back on, Stephen. We've got Colonel Pete Sniffen, U.S. Army War College chaplain, class of 81, parent of the class of 19, Amelia, his daughter. He'll join us and talk to us about faith and the military and the lessons he's learned through this all. And then on May 19th, Senator Pat Toomey, a current and past parent, U.S. Senator for state of Pennsylvania, will join us. And a lot between now and then will be going on with the federal government. So I'm sure Senator Toomey's going to have a lot to say. So we still have a few dates here between April 30th and May 14th that we're going to fill in. But for now, we're going to sign off. And thanks again, Stephen, for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's great.
Have a great night. I'm going to get this to work here any second. Take care, everybody.